Unmanned Sky. Thank you for a $10 super chat. Why does everyone say simulators are not a replacement for real-world flying? Are the sim physics off? Is there extra latency? Velocidrone seems pretty close to the real thing to me. So Unmanned Sky, here's the analogy I like to make about simulators. So first of all, some simulators definitely don't have the best physics. All the simulator developers say, we swear the physics is correct. And what that means is, in some, not all cases, but some cases, what that means is that they went into the physics engine and they set gravity to 9.8 meters per second, or is it 3.4 meters and it's 9.8 feet per second? I don't know. They set all the physical constants in the physics engine correct. And then they were like, yeah, physics is correct. But it doesn't mean that they cross-checked the physics against the performance of real quadcopters. And some of the best simulators, that's what they do. They literally compare the movement of a quadcopter in the real world with a simulated quadcopter in the sim, and they look for ways that the physics engine is not accurately, because just because you set the numbers correctly in a physics engine doesn't mean it's going to actually, it depends on the accuracy of the engine. And also, quadcopters are weird. The things that they do are oftentimes hard to predict and hard to simulate because of the way they fly. So the best simulators will have compared real world to their engine and have validated their results. Even then, though, imagine that you took my quad. This is the analogy I like to make that I sort of teased earlier. Imagine you have a racing drone that you love to fly, and you're an expert, and you could just fly it like with your eyes closed, right? And now I say, hey, you want to try my quadcopter? My quadcopter is going to feel different than yours, even if you set the rates to be the same. I have different motors. It weighs differently. It just is different. There's always little differences. And I think some of the things that people feel when they go into a simulator and they say this doesn't feel right is just the difference between whatever the simulator is simulating and the way that they prefer their quad to fly. So simulators are not a replacement for real-world flying because it's difficult to perfectly simulate your exact quadcopter in the real world. You get stick time in the sim, you learn things, it's definitely good. In the end, you have to take it out and fly it in the real world. The other reason simulators are not a replacement for real-world flying is mental. And that's not what people are usually talking about, but I think it relates to your question. Because when you fly in the simulator, there are no stakes. If you crash, you just hit the reset button and you'll start over. And so you'll see these guys getting these amazing times when racing in the simulator, performing these feats that in the real world, you would have such a low chance of success that you would crash 100 times and destroy thousands of dollars in gear before you got that one perfect lap. But in the simulator, you can hunt for that one perfect lap because there's no consequence to crashing. And mentally, you know it. When you race in the real world and you know that if you crash, you're going to have to go pick up your quad and you might have damaged $200 in gear or $400 in gear. You know that and you feel it in your gut in a way that you don't in the simulator. Simulators are great training tools, and they're a lot of fun. You 1000% should work out tricks in the simulator before you work them out in real life, especially if it's a weird trick like a trippy spin where, like, what even am I even doing with the sticks? Figure that stuff out in the simulator first, for sure. Big Data Pimp has a great point as well, which is that the feel of a sim depends on your system. If you have an old clunker, it doesn't feel the same. That's true. You need to be getting as high a frame rate as you can. If your simulator is not giving you at least 60 frames per second, then you should lower the graphics. You ideally want to be getting 100 plus frames per second, and many people have said that the more frames per second they get, the better the simulator feels. And the reason for this is that the physics calculations are done at the same frame rate as the graphics calculations. Okay, people who design video games may nitpick that sentence. It may not be exactly right. But the gist of it is that the higher your graphical frame rate, the better the physics simulation is. So if you typically run at like the best graphics quality, and you're only getting 60 FPS. And I used to think, well, I got a 60 FPS monitor, so there's no point in running the simulator faster than 60 FPS. That is not true. Turn your graphics all the way down, uncap the frame rate, and run the graphics at as fast as they'll go, and the physics will actually feel better. Know Your Joe wants to know which are the better sims. Well, funny you ask. It's Blunty and I did a video where we tried like all the simulators we could find and came up with the best simulator for how was this video doing? 250K views. That's pretty good. So I would highly recommend if you're trying to decide on a simulator. This is still pretty up to date. I guess you know what? I'm going to real quick. Now that it's this information is still pretty up to date, I'm just going to take this date out of the title so that people don't like go, oh, it's only from January. I guess we won't look at this. Boondock Striker asks, why can't any of the simulators ever get gravity right? It's the one thing that never changes. So two things, Boondock Simulator. I promise you that every single simulator you've ever flown has the correct gravitational constant. Right? Obviously they do. That's like the simplest thing. And I promise you that all of those simulators, if you just drop an object and time how long it takes to get to the ground, it will be the correct number. So why doesn't the gravity feel right in a simulator? And I think there's two reasons the gravity doesn't feel right. Everybody says simulators feel floaty. The first one is if your machine is running at a low frame rate, it's possible that the physics calculations are not working right, even though the gravitational constant is correct in the simulation, in the physics engine. It's possible if you have a low frame rate that it's not going to end up calculating correctly. The other thing is that they try to do drag calculations in the simulator. Drones have drag. If you think about it, what makes a drone slow down? You don't have brakes. You can't step on the brakes. A drone slows down when you drop the throttle purely based on drag. And it turns out that the drag calculations for a drone are very difficult because the surface area of the drone changes depending on which way it's facing, right? And which way it's moving. And there is a ton of nonlinear, turbulent, vortex stuff based on the props. Drag calculations for a drone are essentially impossible to do, like a full accurate simulation. And so all of the simulators use shortcuts to try to calculate the drag and make the drag feel real. The drag is what happens when you drop the throttle and the drone slows down. And drag also comes into play when the drone falls. The effect of the props on falling is very difficult to simulate. So one reason that simulators feel floaty and gravity feels wrong is that the way that they're trying to get that drag calculation to cheat and shortcut the drag calculation may not feel right. The other thing is that that's interesting. The other thing is that in the real world, you're terrified of hitting the ground. And I think this is a bigger factor than people realize. In the real world, when you are inverted and you drop the throttle, you freak the F out because you know you're about to hit the ground. And it feels, but have you ever had a situation where you crash and you disarm and then you just watch your quad fall out of the sky and it feels like it's falling forever? But when you're flying and you go inverted, it feels like you need to flip over again. I think on the simulator, you're just not scared And I bet that the quad isn't as floaty as it feels like it is. It's just mental.